Welcome to the Win Win Evangelism Podcast. I'm Tina Waldrom from Evangelism in Australia. You know, I love helping you feel confident and inspired to share Jesus, whether you're an individual or a pastor looking to help your church engage in evangelism naturally and, more importantly, consistently. Before today's interview with Geoff Folland from Power to Change Australia, I want to invite you to the Share Jesus membership, where you and your church congregation can receive my ongoing support and training to share Jesus naturally and consistently. I believe it's time this year for you and your church to reap the seeds that you've been sowing. You can find out more at sharejesus.com.au. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Geoff Folland. Geoff's the National Director of Power to Change Australia, where their mission is all Australians knowing Jesus. That's it in a nutshell. In our conversation today, we're going to be discussing why evangelism events still matter, even though faith is shared relationally in our nation. I'll be discussing Geoff's recent thoughts and some writings, where I'll drop the links to, around the connection between evangelistic events and relational evangelism in our nation. We'll look at the history, how big events have worked and how relational evangelism fits in. Plus, I'm going to raise that issue of the validity of evangelism events today. Welcome to you, Geoff.
Thank you, Tina. It's great to be here.
Great to have you back on the show. Now, let's talk about these. You've done some great writing over the summer, and people can find that at your LinkedIn, which I'll drop the links to. But You've pointed out that Australia's big evangelism moments weren't really about the stadium. Mm-hmm. They were what happened locally. Why do you think that keeps showing up in history, and what does that mean? The moments weren't about the stadium, they were about what happened locally.
Yeah, I think when I was reflecting on the story, I've been in ministry for 30 plus years. I remember watching the 1979 Billy Graham crusade on television. I think my parents went to the crusade, but I was only 9. But even afterwards, as I came into ministry, people a lot of church leaders still seem to talk about how do we recapture those moments where we can fill a stadium with an evangelist, and who would the evangelist be now that Billy Graham can't do it, and all that sort of thing. I kind of had this picture in my mind. And a lot of people thought, well, that time has passed, and so. I moved to Melbourne from Sydney 5 years ago, and when I moved to Melbourne, I was reading up on the history. I'm a missionary, so I'm like, Melbourne culture is different to Sydney culture, You got to do some research on the culture you've moved into, and history shapes our culture. And so I learned about the R.A. Torrey Crusades in 1902 and 1903, and it was just an incredible moment, 50 years, 60 years before Billy Graham turned up, and it also transformed the city. But the thing that I realized with both of the R.A. Torrey Crusade and the Billy Graham one was that both events had local expressions supporting them. That Billy Graham, they trained thousands of counselors in their Christian life and witness class, and people invited their friends to the event. And if Christians hadn't invited their friends to the event, then the events wouldn't have succeeded. And they wouldn't have invited their friends if they hadn't received training in their local context. So I think that it's focusing on a stadium and a preacher actually misses the point of what's essential for the success of an outreach like that.
Yes, I love that. And I loved reading how you highlighted that, because you can tend to, Geoff, start to think, oh, well, we don't want any big events, whether they're like a stadium event that you're talking about that we've seen in the past, but even events like churches hold evangelistic events still. And
That's
we
right.
can start to think, well, they're not relevant at all. But as I read and reflected on your writings, I thought, oh, hang on, we need to just have a little pause here. There is that strong connection.
I'd also say, even in Melbourne, there's more of a skepticism towards even events as such. It feels too institutional. And so I would say even many of our church leaders have lost their missional imagination. I call it losing their missional imagination for how does outreach actually work. And
Mm.
so the question is then, well, all we're left with is the relational evangelism side. But for many of our everyday Christians, I like to call you people who aren't professional evangelists, they feel isolated when they're out there by themselves, and they feel ignorant and they don't know what to do, and they feel intimidated because they perceive hostility from the culture around them. So the question is, what do we do as leaders who have a heart for evangelism? What do we do to make their job easier?
Mm. It's a great thought. So let's push into this a little bit because events or campaigns, whatever we want to call them, massive events, small events in churches, they seem to give Christians, and from your research, it highlights they give Christians a push to actually act.
Mm.
You know, having that, you highlighted that so beautifully, having there's a time we're having an event, there is it pushes people to act. Tell me a little bit more about that.
So many of us believe evangelism is important. And I moved to Melbourne, to lead a missional organization, but very easily I moved halfway through COVID lockdowns. So my first 12 months were where I couldn't go 5 kilometers from my house, and there weren't too many opportunities for relationships, right? And so it was very easy to fall into habits of not taking advantage of the relationships around me. I did some evangelism training in our local church, not because I didn't know how to do evangelism, but I knew that by turning up for a few weeks to talk about who we're looking to share our faith with, that it would actually raise the temperature for me. It would put it back on the front of my mind. And so if you think that evangelism is always on, which it should be, it's very easy for it to slip into the I'll get to it sometime. But if you put an event on, it draws a line in the sand and creates a sense of urgency for people that I've got something that I'm trying to work towards. It could be the start of an alpha course. It could be a Christmas or an Easter outreach. But if I'm cultivating relationships with friends and I'm starting spiritual conversations, and then I've got something to invite them to, then that, whether or not they're ready for that moment, it actually puts it on my agenda to be praying more intentionally, to be actively doing some training in preparation for that. So
Yeah.
that's what I think the event does for us. And at least that's one aspect of what it does.
Yes, it 100% does push people to act in that way, which I really love about that. I worked for the Billy Graham Association, and before I worked with them, Geoff, I didn't realise that when they did put on those massive stadium events all around the world, that they do have this Christian Life and Witness training. So that's a real plus because you've got thousands of people literally through that organisation that are trained to share their faith just because they're putting on an event, which that could be simulated at a local level. Do you think?
Absolutely. And in fact, I'd be interested in hearing your what you know, but I've heard anecdotally that Billy Graham Association would say that just as many people became Christians before the event, lead up to the event, or immediately after the event, through the local, evangelism, the local sharing, as actually became Christians at the event. Um,
Yes.
yeah, so because it's actually helped the everyday Christians. And so I go back to the points. What stops everyday Christians sharing their faith? They feel isolated. They feel like they're at it by themselves. They feel ignorant. They don't know what to say if somebody asks them, and they feel intimidated because they feel the culture's hostile. If you provide training, it addresses the ignorance question. I don't know what to say. Well, I'm training you in how to express what you know. And, I have a friend who says, oh, you shouldn't give people training in evangelism because, if you love Jesus, it should just ooze out of you, you don't need to have training on how to tell someone how much you love your wife. And I was like, well, perhaps there's a little more theological content that I'm trying to convey, and I remember I grew up in church and I remember sitting through, sermons for years, every week for years. And it was like I had a pile of sermon notes here that if someone asked me a question, I could pull out information of what I've heard and I could refer to it. But if you ask me cold, what is the basic message of Christianity? What does someone who's not a Christian need to know? Like, it wasn't until I received training that I actually synthesized or simplified that into a message that I could communicate.
Yeah. So very true. And thankfully, I thought it was that easy too when I first met Jesus. Why isn't everyone sharing their faith? Well, I'm an evangelist, so it was easy for me.
That's right.
But I've realised actually a large part of my role is to encourage and equip the church at large to be able to engage with people. It's not that it's not oozing out of them, but there are tricky questions, there are hard questions, and there are things that we need some ideas around and cultural contexts. Look, let's talk about something that's probably a little bit challenging, but you talked about the local context or the soil determines what grows from the evangelistic event that
Mm.
is put on, whether that's again on the massive level or it's on a smaller local level. So, what are some ways that churches can actually get the soil ready if they're going to run an event?
Yep. So one of the things that Power to Change does is we run My Friends training. So it's like, how do you cultivate the relationships, right? Um, but I think about the average Aussie, you know, 60% of Aussies have never been inside a church. They don't think about church. The first time you talk to someone about Jesus might be the first time they've even been asked to consider anything about Jesus for, not a week or a month, but maybe a year or 10 years. So they're starting cold. And so one of the other great advantages of an event is that the event can actually create an awareness. People can start thinking about spiritual things so that when you come to them, they're not starting at zero. They still only might be 10 degrees, but they're still not starting at zero. And so it's just a little bit easier to get that first conversation happening. Um, and so, I thank God, for example, for our Christian radio stations, Vision and all the local stations in each country, in each city, and Rima and all the rest of them, because there are people who just tune in, not
Mm-hmm.
Christians, but because they're on that Christian radio station or on that radio station, they're hearing, they're being, cultivated. Somebody, I was talking to an evangelism pastor once. We'd moved into a new house in Sydney, and a few weeks after we'd moved in, we got a postcard in the letterbox about the upcoming Christmas service for that church. And the next year, about 3 months after Christmas, I was talking to the pastor, and I said, "Oh, I was so glad to get this postcard from your church about Christmas services." And he goes, "Oh, we've decided not to do that again." I was like, "Why have you decided not to do it again?" "Oh, we didn't actually think we got anybody new at church from that postcard, left letterbox dropping the whole neighborhood." And I was like, "Well, is that the measure of success, that you expect a postcard to cause people to turn up at church?" What it did was, for me, as a new neighbor in the neighborhood, I met my retired neighbors on one side of me who were an old Catholic couple. We had an immigrant family from Mauritius who were Buddhists on the other side. And across the road, we had a Baha'i family, Persian Baha'i family. And I was like, there's no way they're going to church from a postcard. But that postcard gave me an excuse to talk to them about, "Oh, did you get the postcard? What did you think about that? Have you ever been to church?" And so it gave me permission to start a conversation, which I
Yeah,
wouldn't have,
brilliant.
I would have found much harder if the church hadn't paid the price, hadn't paid for all this letterbox dropping. So,
Yeah, so true. Exactly, exactly. And I guess when we're talking about the effect of, events that we might run as a church, um, and that soil, I guess we need to look at how we're going to even disciple people.
hmm
If we are going to be continuing to encourage events in our church, inviting our congregations to invite people to do some training, um, I guess we have to
well,
pay attention to that.
that's right. Um, and as a leader, in the Shift and Dem training that Power to Change offers, we talk about the process, and if someone comes to faith in Christ, what do you have prepared for them for follow up?
Mm,
If you're expecting them to turn up to Sunday church and that's the thing that's going to disciple them in their faith, then it may not be suitable for a brand new Christian, or it may not cover all the material because you're trying to meet the needs of the whole congregation, not that individual or those people who are brand new in their faith. If you're only aiming it at them, then of course you're not servicing the needs of the whole congregation either. I had a student at Macquarie Uni back in the day who was exploring faith, and his friend invited him to his local Anglican church, and they were preaching through the book of Isaiah. Now, the book of Isaiah is a great book of the Bible, right? But is it the place I'd start with someone who's exploring faith for the first time? It's probably not. I'd probably go to a gospel instead. And, so we need to be thinking about what's, if the church service can't do everything we need, what other things do we need? And some of the research about the great impact of the events like the Billy Graham Crusade showed that in Sydney, there was more of an ecosystem where churches already had systems in place. There was youth ministries in place, connected and so on, that actually captured the fruit. Whereas in Melbourne, and I say this with fear and trepidation as a new Melburnian from Sydney, and we all know the rivalry that exists there. But the research was suggesting that Melbourne relied more on parachurch ministries, that meant that people dropped in and out more easily rather than being part of a united ecosystem. And so I think, not that I'm pro parachurch, but the reality is we need to be thinking carefully about what are we doing with people. It can't be just a one and done deal. It's got to be part of a whole system
Yes.
of thought about what are we doing to capture people's interests and help them take the next step, and then help them grow and mature and become all that God's called them to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're kind of wrestling through this idea of this local soil, at how it needs to look, and the long-term fruit. So we can be positive about having events, and that's definitely the message that we want to convey here today. But how do you get that long-term fruit? Just say if you are going to run events, if the expectation is we have an event and then people come to church and that's our tick box measure of success, it's probably not the greatest step. It's probably some other things. Are we engaging with that person during the week? Have we got them some information? Is someone caring for them one-on-one, or whatever that is, the tracking, which that seems to be the hardest thing about discipling people, Geoff, and winning people to Jesus. It seems to be that's the hardest bit. What happens after someone says, oh, I'm interested in Jesus?
That's right. And I think that's where, in Australia, our temptation is to run big Christmas events, the carols in the park and so on. And we can get great crowds of people at those events. And I think that's wonderful. I'm never going to say, anything bad about an event like that. But the fact that it's in the middle of the Christmas crazies, and then people do Christmas Day and then they disappear for 3 or 4 weeks on summer holidays, means that follow-up from Christmas is almost impossible. And so even though it's easy to get people to a carols event, sometimes I wonder, is it the most strategic use of our resources? Perhaps we're better off doing a big Easter event where the follow-up is more immediately possible. And again, I'm not being, I'm trying not to be programmatic about it. I'm just trying to say, that's the kind of thinking I think we need to do with all of our things. It's like, yeah, this is a great event, but what's after this? What's the next step after that? How do I help someone take the next step? And how do I make that next step as small as possible so that it's as easy for them to take it?
I think that ties it in beautifully, Geoff, because what we're trying to encourage is, yes, have an event, but then the relational side of evangelism has to be able to function highly.
That's
and
right.
like you're saying, if people are away at Christmas or whatever, then it challenges that equation. I'm not saying that dismisses it completely. I'm just saying, highlighting that is the challenge. So from
That's
your
right.
perspective, how do you simply describe this connection between the event evangelism and relational evangelism? How do they work together?
Yeah, I think the other thing that I wrote about in the articles was the fragmentation of society. So 1959, you could have George Beverly Shea and Billy Graham standing up on a stadium, in the stadium, and it was the one type of music, and it was the one type of message. And I think particularly for Billy Graham, he really resonated with that post-World War II era where there was the threat of communism and the fear of a nuclear holocaust, and the message was common. There was a common sentiment across the world. And I did wonder if COVID would provide that moment for us again. But through technology, social media and so on, what we've seen instead is an increasing fragmentation. And so the question that I wrestled with was, well, what does a national event mean, or a large scale event mean, if everybody's coming at it from a different perspective or a different place? And
Mm.
so the advantage that we get when you stop and go, okay, no, Billy Graham wasn't just an event. It was actually a lot of localized things. The R.A. Torrey Crusade in 1902 was actually 50 different centers of evangelism that climaxed in what was happening in the exhibition center. And that's ignoring, of course, all the prayer that happened before the Torrey event and the prayer that happened before the Billy Graham event. But what we see is that now it's possible to mobilize people in a local event. So we were thinking about the Jesus film. There's a new Jesus film coming out. We talked about it a couple of years ago. It's been delayed, but I was thinking about it's coming out in 100 languages. Australia is so multicultural. There's no way that one speaker and one type of music. We couldn't even all watch the Super Bowl apparently because there had to be an alternate, halftime show because a whole bunch of people didn't want to listen to that music, right? We can't do that as a Christian thing. But if we had, if we have a local event that's connected to a national campaign, then we can adapt the local event to our community while still benefiting from the profile and the public awareness that's happening at the grand scheme of things. So in the third article, I talked about how we have we as a Christian community struggle to there's no figure like Billy Graham who's going to come in and capture the national attention now. And in fact, if there is, that we probably don't want them. They're going to be the wrong sort of person. But what we do have is that there are cultural waves that are coming in that Christians have always been using, that we can ride that wave of momentum to hold events. And so, for example, in the middle of this year, there's the FIFA World Cup. And in the US, it's being held in the US and Canada. And our athletes ministry, Athletes in Action in the US and Canada, have teamed up with Fellowship of Christian Athletes, who are in the US, and Fellowship of Christian Athletes is here in Australia as well, to hold local events to watch soccer games. And if you want to talk about multicultural, Australia, soccer or football is the kind of unifying thing. There's going to be thousands and millions of people watching soccer who probably don't normally do it. It's a cultural wave we can anticipate.
Yes.
And we have tools available to help people run evangelistic watch parties, for example.
Yeah.
We can say the same thing about the Rugby World Cup next year. So there's going to be 2.7 million tourists to Australia to watch rugby. And rugby, it's going to be an international event. It's going to tap into a whole range of different communities within Australia. And so how do we as a church, national church, prepare to take advantage of that? You think about The Chosen. I've been talking to the guys who are working with The Chosen. We've seen 5 seasons come out. Season 6 comes out in October this year, with a movie cinema release for the probably in Easter next year or March, somewhere in there, and then season 7 the year after. Well, we know that's coming out. How do we prepare for it? How do we take advantage of that? The Jesus film will come out after that, and then 2030 is the Brisbane Olympics. And if anyone was around for the Sydney Olympics in 2000, there was a whole campaign that went attached to that. So we can't necessarily manufacture waves of momentum, but we can ride them if we're well organized. And if we do it together, then actually we can benefit and help each other.
Yep, that's a great answer. And that just provokes a whole lot of questions, doesn't it? Like if I was a pastor right now pastoring a church, I'd be thinking, okay, you've just mentioned some major events that are coming that we could ride the wave of. How can we get the most out of those events?
Right.
How can we be running events through our church? How can we be connecting with our local community? Because the culture is talking about these things.
That's right.
And so how do we relationally engage?
That's right. So you can go to victorybeyondthecup.com and download resources for how to use the FIFA World Cup as an outreach event. It's right there. It's all being prepared for you.
Okay, well, we're in our show notes. We'll drop a whole lot of links to
Mm.
these events that Geoff's talking about as well, and some of the resources that maybe you're not aware of that are out there that you can be utilising. And that's why we run the podcast, is trying to get interesting people on the show so that we're giving you information that can be helpful in the Australian setting. If you look back at the research that you've done and the 3 articles that you've written, what do we need to be aware of that we don't do?
Yeah, I think firstly we need to understand what role events do play. You know, there's kind of the skepticism that we don't need events anymore, and then there's the, oh, we just need to replicate what was done in 1959. You know, but we actually need to step back and think about that more helpfully in our local context. I mean, how many local churches have run an outreach event and there's been no non-Christians in the room? You know, because they just haven't, they've held the event, but they haven't done all the work that's needed to lead up to it to make it successful. Um, so I think that's probably the first thing, is that we need to understand what role events play. We don't want to be event driven. We need to be strategically driven and use the events to advance the mission that God's called us to. I think that's the first thing. Um, it's yeah. What out of the articles, is there anything that stood out to you, Tina, that you wanted to mention? Because I'm drawing a blank at the moment.
That's all right. I love it when the guest flips that around and asks me the question. So thank you. I feel like I'm being interviewed. Yes, what I loved about the articles was that connection, was that it's assumed that as leaders or believers that we would notice that we would think, oh, there's a big event. Let's take one of the Billy Graham events, because many people would be familiar with them. But you can forget how much relational equity is in that event. You can just think, oh, it's a big event and someone is just trying to gather all of the Christians to bring their friends to an event. But what you don't see is, yes, those opportunities to train the church that are
Mm.
very proactive, but those opportunities for people to upskill in the relational area, to have conversations before events, to have conversations after events, and the strategy that's behind it and the working of the two together is the thing that is, I think, is very important for us to remember,
That's
that they do work together.
So if I take the history of Power to Change in Australia, so Campus Crusade was birthed in the US in 1951, right? And I love the fact that we're connected into this global organization and all these resources we can give away, the Victory Beyond the Cup, we can give away Jesus film, all that stuff. But Power to Change started in Australia when a guy by the name of Geoff Fletcher in 1967, well, he turned up to the Berlin World Congress on Evangelism, and he was looking for a tool to train, as they called them then, lay people in how to share their faith, because the 59 Crusade had been, almost 10 years earlier, and they were looking for a fresh way of training people, and they came across the four spiritual laws. And they came and ran the four spiritual laws training because they saw the value of continuing to train everyday Christians in how to share their faith. And the that training was so popular and demand was in such demand that it expanded beyond the church and the denomination that was paying him. And they said, well, you can either restrict it to what we're paying you to do, or you can start your own organization. And so he started what was then Lay Institutes for Evangelism, became Life Ministries. Campus Crusade for Christ Australia is now called Power to Change. Um, so I see that in that 1950s, 60s era, that there was a real sense of, we need to equip everyday Christians. And that's why I think there's people like yourself, Tina, who are continuing to offer that coaching. We do the same thing. I actually think it's more challenging now than it was back in the 60s to do evangelism. Not because the soil is harder, although it is. People are more broken, so they feel the need for when you share the gospel, I think they respond differently. But the challenge we face in our multicultural, fractured culture is that there's no two people we talk to who are exactly the same.
Correct,
And
yeah.
so I can be really good at sharing the gospel with someone who's like me, but there's almost nobody in Australia who's like me. Uh,
Yes.
So how do I take what impacted my life and translate that so that it can impact the life of someone else? And so the value of training, that the event, like, oh yeah, I need to do evangelism training. I should go and get some evangelism training. Well, the event gives you the excuse to up the ante for getting that training, and that
Mm.
training is what will last beyond the event.
Yes, I love that. So this is the challenge if you're listening as a senior leader is that yes, run great events, and so many leaders are wonderful at running great events, but make sure that we up on the other side in terms of training and training our people relationally, how they're having those conversations, how they're having those conversations afterwards, after these events, so to speak, take place is it's really vital. So there's a lot more thinking. I think that we can see a lot more fruit from our events across the country with just really a little bit more thinking around these areas of what is happening afterwards, what's happening beforehand, how much we can add value add really to people in our congregations. So yeah, extremely helpful articles. I'm going to drop all of those links in the show notes so you can link to Power to Change and the different resources that Geoff has talked about, but also to the articles that Geoff has on his LinkedIn profile as well. We'll put all of that there for you. So this has been wonderful, Geoff, to have you back. I hope you come back again.
I'd love to, Tina. It's always stimulating for me. I'm going to have trouble getting back to my emails this afternoon.
It's been great having you on the show. Thank you once again.
Thank you.